Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a book review for Fireborne by Rosaria Munda. Flat out right now, if you feel that you have similar taste to me in books, just pick up this book. You don't even have to watch the rest of this video. I feel like I get so annoying when I'm excited about books, but I loved it. I loved it so much. I feel like the synopsis that is on the book, it tells you what it's about, but I did not realize exactly what I was getting into when I picked it up, and man, it's the premise. This is probably going to sell some of you already. So imagine if you had an Anastasia-like character where their whole family was killed. Well, you're following that child, and that particular character, it's one of our main point of views. His name is Lee, and it turns out his family, they were terrible people. His family, they ruled kind of with an iron fist. They were absolutely atrocious to a lot of their people, and they died when he was so young that he's kind of had to reconcile the memories that he has of his family because he was a boy and he loved them. But he has to come to terms with the fact that the rest of the kingdom is super pumped that his family is no longer ruling. He's had to grow up within the society that celebrates the murdering of his family. And what I think is really fascinating is that as he grows into a young man, he actually agrees with the principles that the new government holds. However, nobody knows that he is the son of this royal family that they took over, and he's kind of within the belly of the beast because he has the opportunity to become basically a dragon rider for this new governing body. And so he's kind of right there in the middle, learning from the people that took over his family. He has them as almost like mentor figures. They just don't realize who he is because he spent a lot of his life growing up in an orphanage, and it wasn't until he got older that he kind of tested into this program, and now he's surrounded by the very people that slaughtered his family. So it's kind of like a combination of Anastasia and French Revolution. So that's Lee's character. And then you have Lee's best friend, who was a girl who was orphaned at a very young age because of the terrible things that Lee's family did. And these two characters met at the orphanage. The amount of nuances with their relationship, the way that their trauma is shown in this story, it's done so well. Those are our main two perspectives throughout the story, and I feel that the author, they took some risks in a couple of the things that they did with the perspectives in this story, because you do go back and forth between Lee and then Annie is the other character. You go back and forth between these two individuals while also occasionally having these third person point of view flashbacks. These are sprinkled throughout the story. It's not like you're getting tons and tons of flashbacks. You're not getting whole chunky chapters of flashbacks or anything like that. You just get these little pieces of their past. I actually really loved these little snippets of their past. I think the way that they played into things in present day were masterfully done, and this is a debut. I was so impressed with how well the author incorporated these things without feeling like a crutch, because that can happen when you have these flashback sequences. It feels like this is the author not knowing how to incorporate the things in the character's past that shape them. They don't know how to incorporate that into the story, so they're just like, here's what happened back in the day. I thought the reveals that the past stuff had, and again, these are just little tiny snippets, but the reveals of those things with present day, it was emotional, and it was so good. And while you do primarily just stick with these two perspectives and then this other little one that is in third person periodically throughout the story, you don't get side character perspectives, but the side characters, what little bits we get of them, pack a huge punch. And that, I think, is due to the author's care of developing the nuances of what it would be like to have a family overthrown and a new governing body. The world building stuff with the politics, the economy. She doesn't spend paragraphs and paragraphs explaining like, well, this is the best ways in which the kingdom makes money, and this is how everybody lives, this is what they do. She kind of just has stuff really well integrated into the story without feeling like giant info dumps. One example is early on in the book, because one of the classes that the main characters are a part of has to do with censorship and them kind of deciding what works from the former government aren't really appropriate for everybody to read now. What can we shove at people now to make them support our cause? And I thought that was really interesting, because you do see this new governing body ruling in a way that I think the majority of people would be like, yeah, that's probably a better, more fair way to rule, but also it's not perfect. And I just feel like this one part really early on, the characters are walking through town basically, and the way that the new government wants to set things up is, hey, your blood shouldn't determine your potential in life. Your potential in life should be determined by work. You should be able to ascend with your education, with this test. That is the way they have it right now. There's a test you take, and depending on how you do with this test, you have the opportunity to be a part of different castes, essentially. And while that is better in theory, because you're allowing people the opportunity to elevate themselves, it also doesn't always work out particularly well for people. But the propaganda in the story that you see in this one little moment where the characters are walking through town, and there's like ways that the different classes are being supported. So I think there's one that's like the iron, and they're like, the working class that supports our country. And you're just like, oh, okay. That's just one little example. Throughout the book, there are so many instances where I feel like the author illustrates this takeover, this revolution, and the difficulties of that. She illustrates it so well, to the point where I was like confused, because I'm like, why does this feel so much better? It felt so much more natural and organic than I have seen from other fantasy stories. And then when I finished the book, I read the little author bio in the back, and she studied political theory at Princeton, and I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. It shows so much. She put her knowledge into giving me the political, economic fantasy story I feel like I've always wanted. And there's dragons. The dragons are not as much in the story as maybe you would expect given the cover. I mean, they're still there though. So if you can give me a super political story that happens to have dragons too, I'm all in. I do want to say, if you're not into political stories, if you like more action-packed, fast-paced type fantasy stories with really elaborate magic systems, you're not gonna get that with this. The magic in the story, I wouldn't even really describe it as magic. It's more of like the bond that they have with their dragons, and that's pretty much it. It's really not particularly fantastical. It's more of like historical fiction fantasy in a way, and if you're not really a big fan of that, this is maybe not going to be the story for you. The little propaganda thing that I mentioned at the beginning, things like that are done throughout the story, and this idea of, hey, is this new government better than the last one? That plays such a big role later in the book, to the point where I wanted to cry when the characters were faced with some extremely difficult decisions. That's a trope, I think, in fantasy books too, is, oh, the difficulties of ruling. Can any ruler really ever be good? Because you have to think about the entirety of the kingdom, what's best for everyone, and what's best for everyone isn't always an easy decision to make. And also, often it means that some people are going to hurt in some way, or they're going to die, and you have to make that decision. And when the characters are confronted with these sorts of things in other fantasy books, I love it. I've always loved that trope. But in this one, it just took it to a new level where I was like, it's not fair. Why do you have to do this? It's so good. I'm sorry. I'm just making like weird noises and hand gestures because it was so good. I'm going to calm down and start talking about some of the things that might be seen as negatives for some people. One of which would just be the beginning of the book. When I first picked this up, it's about 50 pages in. I was texting my husband when he was on his lunch break, and he's like, oh, how are you liking it? I'm like, I mean, it's okay so far. I did not have strong feelings toward the beginning of the book, and it wasn't until the story kind of progressed to a certain point that I really became invested. I think that's common in character-led stories or political stories, because it takes time to get to know the characters, it takes time to get to know the world, and so it wasn't just action-packed right from the beginning. There's so much intrigue. It wasn't really like that. And it's also disorienting because at the beginning of the book, there's this tournament that's going on within the school setting that our main characters are in that has to do with the dragons. And I was like kind of thrown off because the characters, there's a lot of them initially and they're all talking to each other. And then they sometimes have nicknames, and then their dragons have names, and then sometimes their names are kind of tied in with their dragon names, and I was like, I don't know who any of these people are. I also think the beginning comes across like it's gonna be kind of generic, and I didn't find it generic whatsoever, but the tournament element, all these young people, there's clearly some angst between them. Yeah, I definitely thought that the beginning made it seem like it was gonna be pretty good, but maybe a little typical. I did not feel that way at all later in the story, but I do think that the beginning makes you that's the impression it gives. And on the topic of angst, there's some angst in the story. I do think that it was extremely realistic angst though, because they're teenagers and they go through some rough stuff, and the ways that they find friendship and companionship, and then sometimes a little bit more with one another. Yeah, there's some like romantic subplots sometimes between side characters and things like that, and I never at any point felt like this was a romance story, which I don't care, even if it was, who cares? But there is a romance in the story that I was like, please happen. So it definitely had that. There's characters I wanted to ship, but then there were also really realistic relationships between characters to the point where it almost felt like there was a love triangle and then there was like another love triangle that like was a Venn diagram love triangle sort of situation. Some people hear the word love triangle and they're like, I'm not about that. But it was not. It absolutely was not. This country needs my help, but I don't know who I like more. I actually thought it was a very realistic way in which young people, under a lot of pressure, who have other young people around them, they're probably gonna behave the way these characters behaved. Anyway, that is let's be real, that's my gush fest of this story. I don't even know if it can be called a review, but I adored this book. I cannot wait for the sequel. I want that sequel so bad. You feel you have similar tastes to me. If you like political fantasy, if you like stories that take the time to really get to know characters and their trauma, I think that this is absolutely the book for you. And if you also like historical fantasy, I think that you're gonna like this. However, if you are somebody who likes a lot of magic in your story, if you like a really unique world that feels very fantastical, or if you just love a lot of action, that is not what this story is. You're probably gonna pick this up and find it really boring. If you've read the story, let me know your thoughts on it. If you think that this sounds good, let me know if you're gonna read it. Seriously, tag me on Twitter, tag me on Instagram. Let me know in the comments of any other video, hey, I'm gonna pick up Fireborne, because I'm gonna be like, yes, I'm gonna be so excited because I want more people to read this. It's so good. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I'm sorry if I annoyed you with my excitement, and I'll see you guys later.